a few golden objects in his bag, made his way to the towering ramparts of the black marble where the Golden Princess lived. He entered the courtyard, and there discovered a serving girl retrieving water from a well with a golden bucket. "Pretty maid," he said, smiling his kind but unhandsome smile, "do you think your lady might be interested in such trifling works of gold as these?" And he produced two of the finest, most exquisite golden statuettes that man's hand has ever made. The girl was stunned by their beauty. She took them from Johannes and hurried within. Not 10 minutes had elapsed before the Golden Princess herself emerged from the castle holding the statuettes in her hands. She was as gorgeous as her portrait, more so in fact, and as she greeted Johannes, her golden hair flashed in the light and her ocean blue eyes danced with pleasure. Still around her lips there was sadness. "Tell me, old man," she said, "are these really for sale? I've never seen anything so beautiful, so fine." Faithful Johannes bowed. "But there is more, fair princess, much more. My master's ship is full of such wonders, and they can be yours if you will just accompany me down to the harbor." The princess hesitated for a moment, since her last husband-to-be had died. She had not set foot outside the palace. But the allure of the gold was too strong. The ship, and it sets it immediately. Now, my young readers, I know just what you're thinking. You're thinking, stealing a girl? That's an interesting way of winning her heart. Allow me to warn you now that under any other circumstances, stealing a girl is about the worst way of winning her heart you could possibly cook up. But because this happened long ago in a faraway land, it seems to have worked.
Yeah. It worked. No.
Oh no! For the Golden Princess came back up to the deck and saw that her land was far away from her. At first she did indeed protest, and fiercely too, that she had been carried away by low-born merchants. But when one of the merchants revealed himself to be a king and revealed that in addition he was madly in love with her, and when besides Johannes assured her that if she really wanted to she could go home, but she couldn't take the gold if she did, the princess realized that in fact the young king was just the kind of man she would like to marry after all, and decided that she'd give the whole matrimony thing one last shot. And they all lived happily ever after. The end. Are there any small children in the room? If so, it would be best if we just let them think this is really the end of the story and hurried them off to bed, because this is where things start to get, well, awesome. But in a horrible, bloody kind of way. As the ship plowed through the purple sea, the new lovers made moon faces at each other up near the bow. Faithful Johannes was sitting near the back of the ship, admiring the success of his plan, when he noticed 3 ravens alight on a mast beam. The first raven motioned with his beak at the king and princess. "What a lovely couple those two make," he said. And the second said, "Yes, too bad they won't stay that way." The first said, "What do you mean?" "Well," the second replied, "when the ship gets to land, a beautiful chestnut stallion will canter up to the group, and if the king will decide to ride it back to the castle. But if he does, he will be thrown from its back and die." "Good God, that's horrible," said the first raven. "Is there nothing anyone can do?" "Oh, there is," said the second raven. "Someone could kill the horse before the king mounts it. But what good is that? For if someone did and told why he did it, he would be turned to stone from the tips of his toes to the tops of his knees." "To stone?" asked the first raven. "To stone," answered the second. The third raven, who had been listening quietly, cut in at this point. "It gets worse, you know," he said. "If by some chance the 2 lovers escape that danger, another lies ahead. For when they arrive at the gates of the castle, a beautiful bridal gown made of pure gold will be laid out on a bed of purple flowers. The princess will want to wear it, of course, but if she touches it, she will be consumed by a ball of fire and burned to a cinder right there on the spot." "Good God, that's terrible," cried the first raven. "Is there nothing anyone can do?" "Oh, there is," said the third raven. "If someone were to pick up the dress before she could and throw it in the fire, the princess would live. But what good is that? For if someone did it, and told why he did it, he would be turned to stone from the knobs of his knees to the core of his heart." "To stone?" repeated the first raven. "To stone," confirmed the third. Nor is that all, said the second raven morosely, for if the two lovers avoid that tragedy, a final one awaits. When they are married and begin the wedding dance, the new queen will swoon and fall to the floor and die. Good God, that's the worst thing yet, cried the first raven. Is there nothing anyone can do? Oh, there is, said the third. If someone were to bite the new queen's lip and suck 3 drops of blood from it with his mouth, she would live. But what good is that, for if someone did it and told why he did it, he would turn to stone from the core of his heart to the top of his head. To stone? Said the first. To stone, replied the second. To stone, echoed the third. And with that the 3 ravens shook their black beaks, sighed sadly, and flew away. Faithful Johannes buried his head in his hands, for he had heard all. He knew what he would have to do, and that it could not come to good. Just as the ravens had foretold, after the ship had landed, and the king and his wife-to-be had been greeted by all the servants and courtiers of the castle, a beautiful chestnut stallion cantered up to the group. The king tasted that it would bear him in triumph back to the castle. Before he could mount it, Johannes slipped onto its back, drew a blade, cut the horse's throat, soaking its silken coat with warm red blood. It collapsed to the ground in a heap. Cries of shock went up from the crowd. The other servants, who had never loved misshapen Johannes, whispered, "To kill the king's new stallion? Treason! Treason!" The king looked back and forth between Johannes and the dead horse. Johannes's face had no expression. At last the young king said, "Johannes was faithful to my father, and to my father's father, and to my father's father's father before that. He has always understood us, so I will understand him. If he does it, it must be right." Not another word was said about the subject, and the party proceeded, afoot, back to the palace. When they arrived at the gate, they saw a beautiful golden bridal gown lying on a bed of purple roses. "Oh, I shall wear it in the wedding," the queen-to-be explained, running to take hold of the marvelous garment. But before she could reach it, Johannes grabbed it from the flower bed, strode into the great hall, where he threw it into the fire. Again, the party was taken with cries of shock and dismay. The servants huddled together and whispered, "Treason! Treason!" But the king hushed them. "Johannes has always been faithful to me and my family, so I will be faithful to him. If he does it, it must be right." The young king and the golden princess were married the very next day. The princess looked particularly beautiful, her ocean blue eyes brimming with joy. But Johannes watched anxiously. They moved to dance, and the music began. But they had not taken 2 steps when the new queen suddenly swooned and fell to the ground. Before anyone else could move, Johannes swept in, lifted her to his chest, and carried her out of the hall. He hurried through empty hallways, carrying the new queen in his arms to a narrow, winding staircase that led to the highest turret in the castle, his private chamber. When they arrived, he placed her carefully, and with his 2 rotten teeth, bit her lip until he drew blood. Then ever so tenderly the unhandsome man sucked 3 drops of blood from her lip with his mouth. The queen began to stir, but just then the king burst into the room. He had followed Johannes all through the palace and had watched at a crack in the door as Johannes, his once faithful Johannes, had done something unspeakable to his new queen. "Treason!" he bellowed at the top of his lungs. "Treason!" The other king shouted, "Tomorrow he dies!" The next day, Johannes was led from the dungeons to the top of a funeral pyre. There he was tied as a torch was ready to set the great stack of hay and tinder on fire. The king watched with his new queen at his side. She had fully recovered from the day before, but both wore black, and their faces were somber. "He was like a father to me," the young king said. The queen took his hand. The executioner lit his torch, brought it to the pyre, its sparks leaping eagerly at the dry tinder. Behind the king, the jealous servants muttered and smiled to one another. But just before the executioner could set the pyre alight, Johannes called out, "King, to whom I have been faithful, and to whose father, and father's father, and father's father's father, I was faithful before that. Will you allow me to speak before I die?" The young king sadly inclined his head and said, "Speak." So Johannes spoke. He told of seeing the 3 ravens on the ship. He told of hearing them speak. He told of their prophecy of the chestnut stallion. And as he told it, he turned to stone from the tips of his toes to the knobs of his knees. All the spectators gasped, but Johannes went on. He told of the raven's prophecy of the bridal gown, and as he did, he turned to stone from the knobs of his knees to the core of his heart. In the crowd, mouths fell open. Finally, he told the raven's prophecy of the wedding dance, and when he had, he turned to stone from the core of his heart to the top of his head. died. A great wail went up from all assembled, for they had learned, too late, that Johannes had been faithful to the very end and had given his life for the king. The king and the queen, in an effort to honor his memory, took faithful Johannes, grotesque even in stone, placed him beside their bed so that every morning when they woke up and every evening when they lay down they would be reminded of his faithfulness and the great debt they owed him. The end. Well, not really. More like the beginning, for it is here that the tale of Hansel and Gretel truly begins. The king and the queen soon had a pair of beautiful twins, a girl and a boy. They named the boy Hansel, the girl Gretel. They were the light of their parents' lives. Hansel was dark like his father, with black curly hair and charcoal eyes. Gretel was fair like her mother, with hair that looked like it was spun from pure gold thread and eyes that shone like the sea. They were happy children, full of play and mischief and joy. So happy were they, in fact, that they nearly made their parents forget the faithful servant who had saved their lives and how they had nearly betrayed him. Nearly, but not quite. And one day, as the king played with Hansel and Gretel at the foot of his bed, and the queen was off in chapel praying, he began to cry. He understood me, the king said, though I did not understand him. He fell to the foot of the statue and wept. When his tears touched the stone, something miraculous happened. Johannes spoke. "There is a way, king," the stone Johannes said, "to rescue me from this rock if you truly wish it." "Oh, I do," the king cried. "I'll do anything, anything." And Johannes said, "There are no young children, right? You're certain?" Okay. And Johannes said, "You must cut off the heads of your children and smear my statue with their blood, and then, and only then, will I return to life." Remember what I told you would happen when Hansel and Gretel finally showed up? Yeah. The king collapsed on the bed weeping, but he felt he had no choice. "You understood me always, no matter what," he said, "so I will understand you." He stood, beckoned Hansel and Gretel to his side, drew his sword from its place on the wall, and cut off their heads. Their lifeless bodies dropped to the floor. See? The king took their blood on his hands and smeared it on the statue. Just as he had foretold, Johannes returned to life, covered in the children's blood. And the king, despite the blood, and through his tears at his own children's deaths, threw his arms around his faithful servant Johannes. The end. Nearly. Johannes smiled his sweet crooked smile and said, "You have understood me at the greatest cost." And he placed little Hansel's head back on his body and little Gretel's head on hers, and instantly they began to leap and play as if nothing had happened, and as if they were not covered in blood. And the king threw his arms around them, and then again around Johannes, and they all laughed with joy. The end. Almost. For just then the king heard the queen's footsteps echoing in the hall. He looked at Johannes back from the dead and their children covered in blood. "Quickly," he said, and hurried them all into the wardrobe. When the queen came into the room, he asked her how her prayers had gone, and she replied, "I can barely pray. I think only of Johannes and how we failed him." And the king replied, "What if I told you, dear queen, that there was a way to repay our debt to Johannes and to bring him back to life, but that it was a terrible way, and it would cost us everything that is most dear to us? What would you say?" "Anything," the queen cried. "Anything we can do, we must do. We owe it to him." "Even if it meant killing our 2 children?" the king asked. The queen gasped. She fell to the floor and wept bitterly. At last she said, "I would never do it. I could never do it, but I know we should. We owe him our lives." "I couldn't agree more," the king exclaimed, "and that's why," and as he said this, he opened the wardrobe doors, and out came their 2 beloved children, all covered in blood, followed by a living, breathing Johannes. The queen screamed and fainted. The king threw a basin of water in her face, and she woke up and screamed again. Then the king explained it all to her, and she wept and laughed and threw her arms first around her children and after around Johannes. And then she held them all at once and wept and laughed some more. The end. Sort of. You see, the way the Brothers Grimm tell it, that is the end, but it isn't really. Not at all, for as the king recounted what had happened to his wife, Hansel and Gretel heard and understood. Late that night they lay in their beds, unable to sleep. "Hansel," Gretel said. "Yes, Gretel." "Did you hear what father said?" "Yes. He cut off our heads to save that ugly old man." Hansel was silent. "And Mommy was glad that he did. Do you think they hate us?" Hansel was silent still. "I think we should run away," Gretel said, "in case they want to do it again." "That's just what I was thinking," Hansel answered. "Just what I was thinking."
Messed up.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, dude.
Hashtag bad librarian.
Whoa! Hashtag bad librarian. Let's get it all trended.
Um, so this is the time of the night where, like, I'm reminded of the scariest book ever that I should actually read a passage of, and I just never think about it until now. It's a book called Black Moon by Kenneth Black, and it's about this dystopian world, it's like this post-apocalyptic disease where everybody has insomnia, like chronic insomnia, like you cannot go to sleep. Which at first is just like really inconvenient. I guess I'm just going to explain the whole plot because it's 3:30. And who gives a shit? Who gives a shit at this point? So there's some people who can sleep normally, but the people who are insomniacs are going crazy, and they start killing people who can sleep. Because you go crazy at a certain point, you're just like, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god. You can't steal their sleep necessarily, but like it just feels really good to kill somebody who could sleep, but you can't. So like, it's a really messed up book because you actually, some of it is like through the viewpoints of like these people who are trying to sleep, so they have to like climb up in trees and like strap themselves into the tree to like sleep privately, or like they have to pretend that they're insomniacs themselves, that kind of thing. But then there's also the viewpoint of the insomniacs. Has anybody here had insomnia before?
Yes.
Yeah. We went through grad school. Yeah.
We also went through depression.
Yeah, that's the not so fun part.
Sorry.
Hashtag same. Understood. So, some of the chapters are viewpoints of the insomniacs, and one really troubling chapter is about somebody who actually has an infant, and they don't know where their infant is. Exactly. One of the hallucinations is that the baby was in an underwear drawer for a few days. An underwear drawer? Days.
Okay. Continue.
No spoilers, but you find out later on what happened, and it wasn't pretty, to put it gently. I wouldn't suggest reading it before you go to bed, because that'll keep you up. But there's another book that I'm actually going to read a little bit of, and it's called, Did You Ever Really... Reincarnation is perhaps a bureaucracy, and you don't really understand why you get placed in where you do when you are reincarnated. So let me dive in. This is from the viewpoint of somebody who is in the afterlife and has spent about 60 years watching people filter in and out. He doesn't really understand why he's not getting reincarnated, but at this point he's built a life for himself in the afterlife, so he's kind of like okay with it. See, the tough cases are the souls that don't want to come back. You have to understand that. Sultans come back as chimney sweeps from a Dickens novel. Chimney sweeps come back as politicians who profit from cutting food stamp funding. Some souls do it out of malice. Some souls are navel-gazing too hard to understand why. And it's understandable because people wouldn't want to come back. There's a choice. There's always a choice that you can defer, and there is an appeal process. But it's really just ceremony. Honestly, everybody just comes with the same letter. Dear blank. Now, remember that some people just have the blank. Some people don't even bother to have their names in it. We regret to inform you that your request to stay unplanted has been denied. Please report to the station at a certain date at 2:30. We thank you for your cooperation, Transfer Department. I think the person who took it worse is a Lama. This soul who had lived his previous life as a god. In his religion, he was told that this was his last life, and through him I learned about Nirvana. Since my soul was mainly Western, we had a couple of good chats about Eastern philosophy. My last life was a Catholic family who would have lost their damn mind if they knew what their golden boy was doing. This was 1975, so by then I was enjoying an aged scotch with the Lama. The mustache I was wearing was hardly an improvement. The Lama who was somebody I really enjoyed being around. He started out his term as a little boy in the mountains. His father had farmed goats, and he spent the first 2 years of his life with a strong whiff of goat all over him. Goat's milk, goat fur, goat shit, the usual. In 1839, when he was 3 years old, the other llamas came to his village. The family was suffering from a recent plague that destroyed their business. He was asked as a boy to pick out what item he should have remembered from his past life. Did he actually pick the right one? No. His father had bribed one of the llamas into revealing what the right item was, and the rough man whispered in his son's ear, "The staff, pick the staff, pick the fucking staff." The family too poured to insulate their yurt, but somehow his father could still afford the beer that soured his breath. The llama did what he was told. Even in other lives, he was very good at doing what he was told, and he picked the staff. He was taken from his village, and his family had one less mouth to feed. He was taken to the shrine he was born to oversee. He was pampered and washed in milk and honey before he gave his life to chastity, rarely. Prayer, even more rarely. For that he traveled his region and was afforded gifts of all sorts, which he demurely denied at every turn. Even during political uprisings, he handled himself like the demigod he was supposed to be. He would rage in private of... Oh my god, I'm dying. No, it's fine. He would rage in private of the young men his age who were fighting and being placed into the narrative, but he sought peace wherever his handlers were watching. He would preach peace and understanding in the face of murder and riots in his own crowd. He died at 94 years of age, well loved by his students and prepared to enter nirvana. He was told that he would achieve nirvana at last for his good deeds. What he didn't know was that he'd be placed in a waiting area. Don't get me wrong, the waiting area that he was put into is hardly a prison. There's room service, an all-inclusive tennis court. Tennis is your sport. Oddly enough, there's something for everyone at the waiting room. The rumor is, in BC, the building was a stone temple for everyone. Everyone got assigned their spots to go along. Somehow, when the Industrial Revolution happened downstairs, not having electricity was more of a problem. Of course, less people were dying at the time, so they could have chariot races all day if they wanted to. Then the horseless carriage was invented, so people got greedy. Yeah, I can't do anymore. Oh my god.
Are you okay?
Oh yeah, I'm fine. I just had this weird thing.
The whole book. Alright, you guys are going to hear a gay fairy tale now. I haven't decided which one. Let's see. Hey, Hansel and Gretel! I want to see that. Since, I just did that. Hey. There were once two children who lived with their parents in a cottage on the edge of the great forest, and their parents treated them badly. Who knows why? Perhaps the parents had been badly treated by their own parents and were continuing a family tradition. Perhaps the parents hadn't meant to have children at all and would have been happier with a cat. It was all the same with the children. Sometimes they were neglected, sometimes abused. The girl, whose name was Gretel, had both eyes open and knew how to take care of herself. When there was a storm coming in the little cottage, she knew it and kept out of the way. As a consequence of this, she was more neglected than abused, but the boy, whose name was Hansel, was dreamy and withdrawn, and the only protection he had from trouble was to lose himself in daydreams and old movie magazines, which wasn't always helpful, and so he was more abused than neglected. The brother and sister loved each other very much, and though they had no other companions, they were content and often quite happy. Gretel, neglected by their parents, was glad to feel needed by her brother, and Hansel was grateful to have someone look out for him. One night, when the moon wasn't shining and everyone was asleep, the mother sat up in bed, opened one eye, and said, "It's time to get rid of the children." The father sat up beside her, opened one eye, and said, "I think you may be right. How?" As one does. The mother stared into the dark long and hard. Finally, she said, "We'll take them into the forest and leave them there." The father said, "Good idea." Then they both closed their eyes and lay back down, and when they woke up in the morning, neither of them remembered their conversation. But the father looked out the window. Black clouds stampeded across the sky, and the wind moaned like someone who had just received terrible news. "What a nice day," observed the father. "Let's take the children for a walk in the woods." "Why, that's a wonderful idea," the mother said. "I'll pack a lunch." The father went to the children and told them to get ready because they were all going to go for a walk. Gretel immediately knew something was wrong because they never did anything as a family. She took her brother outside. "Fill your pockets with white pebbles," she told him. "How come?" Hansel wanted to know. "They're taking us for a walk," she told him. "I think they're going to try to lose us." So Hansel stuffed his pockets full. When the lunch was packed, which didn't take long, the family set out into the forest. Soon they were deep among the trees. Hansel, who hated the forest, grew even more withdrawn than usual. Gretel held his hand. Every few steps she whispered, "Now," and Hansel would drop a pebble. When they had walked for quite a while, the parents sat Hansel and Gretel down side by side on a fallen tree. "Children, your mother and I are going to gather some firewood," the father said. "You wait right here for us," the mother said. "Here's your lunch. Don't eat it right away." Then the parents turned around, and by the time they had taken 10 steps, they had forgotten they had even had children, thought they were in the forest to gather firewood. So they picked up a few sticks and carried them back to their cottage. When they were out of sight, the children stood and walked over to where the last of the white pebbles lay. The stones ran back through the forest, glowing faintly in the gloom under the trees all the way to their parents' cottage. "Should we go back?" Hansel wondered. "I don't think so," Gretel said. "Let's see what they gave us for lunch." All they found inside the paper bag was a candy bar. Gretel didn't have much of a sweet tooth, but of all the things Hansel wanted and rarely got, it seemed that a little sweetness was what he got least often. He ate his half of the candy bar happily, and then, because he knew she wouldn't mind, ate Gretel's half as well. Then they took each other by the hand and set off, with their backs turned on the direction they'd come from. They were in the great forest, which is also known as the Endless Forest if you happen to be lost in it, as anyone who'd ever been lost there could tell you, if you could ever find someone who'd ever been lost there and had found his way out. But those people are few and far between because the trees grow very close together there, and the leaves overhead aren't inclined to let much light get through. And while most directions lead deeper into the forest, very few lead out of it. The children walked all day until the gloom slowly turned to complete blackness, and those animals that wake up and look for their dinner in the dark began to do so. Hansel was very nervous, and though Gretel told him everything would be all right, she began to grow a little apprehensive herself. Suddenly, they saw a light up ahead of them, shining between the trunks of the trees. They made their way toward it as quickly as they could, and finally came into a little clearing. There, they found a circle of spotlights on tall black stands. Within that, a circle of movie cameras on dollies, their film running, and though there wasn't a cameraman to be seen. But most amazing of all was the little house in the middle of the clearing, which the lights lit and the cameras filmed, because that little house was made entirely of candy. "Candy!" Hansel exclaimed, and he ran out in front of the cameras, right up to the house, and broke off a piece of it. "Chocolate-covered caramel!" he cried, and began to eat as fast as he could. Gretel, who would have preferred something hot, approached with a certain hesitation. "We can stay here," Hansel said with his mouth full, "forever." Well, Gretel began doubtfully, but that was as far as she got, because at that moment the macadamia nut brittle front door opened and a lady came out. Oh, she was beautiful. She had big bouffant hair the color of moonlight and a wrap of white fur, and when the lights hit her long dress, they broke into 1,000 pieces of dance. She wasn't young at all, and her face had long ago been marked by heartbreak and tragedy, the way long ago the desert was mistreated by the ocean. The lady didn't even glance at Gretel, but looked deep into Hansel's eyes and said, "You," as if he were the one she'd always been waiting for. She had a voice like cigarette smoke, like black silk stockings, like staying up late every night. "Yes," Hansel agreed, and he forgot about eating. "Come in," the lady invited. "Everything's ready." And Hansel walked into the cottage. Then the lady glanced at Gretel, and her face changed, as if Gretel had just said something funny. Not much to look at, are you, honey?" she said. "But you'd better come inside, too. It's going to get cold out here." Gretel didn't like the lady, but she went in after her brother. She didn't like the inside of the house, either. It's true, it wasn't made of candy like the outside, but the dimness and the dust and the clutter made her uncomfortable. The cigarette, burning in an ashtray, was about to fall off onto a little table, and Gretel put it out. "Leave things the way they are, honey," the lady said. "Everything's just the way I like it." Then she turned back to Hansel and said in her magic voice, the one she used only for him, "Come and talk to me." Hansel followed her through the cottage, which was much, much larger on the inside than on the outside, to the lady's dressing room. Her beautiful dresses hung in the closet like sleeping angels, and the lady sat down at a table in front of 3 mirrors. "Make yourself comfortable," she said. "Tell me about yourself." Hansel sat in a little armchair piled with cushions. "Who are you?" he asked, and the lady laughed. It was an enchanting laugh, and Hansel wished more than anything that he could laugh that way. "We're going to be friends," the lady told him. "Do you like magic?" And without waiting for an answer, she opened a jar of cream, smoothed some on her face, and wiped it off with a tissue. "Now," she said, "who shall I be?" She took out pencils and brushes and tiny pots of color, and with just a few strokes she gave herself a completely different face, one Hansel was sure he had seen in either his movie magazines or his daydreams. "Would you like to learn how to do this?" she asked. "Oh, yes," Hansel breathed. "Do you think I could?" The lady moved over and patted the place next to her on the little bench, and Hansel came and sat beside her. She put her pencils to his eyes, then her brushes, and when Hansel looked in the 3 mirrors, he had eyes just like hers. He was very happy. "I have so many secrets to tell you," the lady confided, and in the days that followed, Hansel learned them all. Gretel, meanwhile, had nothing to do. The one thing she could think of, straightening up some of the clutter the lady lived in, was forbidden to her. She only had to wipe the dust off a table with her finger for the lady to appear, saying, "Leave it alone, honey. Everything's already the way I like it." More than anything, Gretel missed feeling needed by her brother, who spent all his time with the lady. Gretel saw that he changed day by day, and it seemed to her that the lady was eating Hansel a little bit at a time. One afternoon, when the children had been living in the cottage for much longer than she liked, Gretel came upon Hansel, seated in front of the 3 mirrors, experimenting with the brushes and the little pots of color. The lady was nowhere in sight. "We have to escape," Gretel said urgently. "What do you mean?" Hansel asked, concentrating on the line he was drawing on one of his eyelids. Gretel looked into the middle mirror and saw that her brother had the lady's eyes. "She's turning you into her," she said unhappily. "No, not really," Hansel said. "She's teaching me how to be a star." He leaned back and looked at himself in the mirror. It seemed to him that the person who looked back at him was stronger and more beautiful than anything Hansel had ever been afraid of. He said, "Tonight she's going to tell me the secret of how to walk in heels. I can't leave now." Then the lady came in and sat next to him on the bench, and Gretel couldn't talk to him anymore. She knew that it was up to her to rescue her brother. Now Gretel had been watching, and she saw that the truth, it was really more of an appetite than a weakness, because in the evenings, while the children had their supper, the lady never ate anything. Instead, she lived on the attention and admiration that she got from Hansel. Brooding on this, Gretel made her plans. On the day Gretel decided to escape from the cottage, she went into the kitchen, removed all the racks from the oven, and began cleaning them as quickly as she could. She had no sooner started than the lady appeared, saying, "Leave that alone, honey. Everything's already the way I like it." "Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot," Gretel said. Then she widened her eyes as if she were seeing the lady for the first time and said, "Why, you're a movie star, aren't you?" Now, it's hard to say exactly what the lady was, but she had certainly been a movie star in her time, and in fact she had been several. So she said, Yes, I suppose I am." She smiled at Gretel, which she hadn't done before. "In fact," Gretel went on, "you starred in my favorite movie of all time." "Really?" the lady marveled, and suddenly she spoke in the magic voice she used for Hansel. "Which one was it?" "The Queen in the Oven," Gretel said. "I saw it 5 times. You were brilliant in it." She crossed her fingers, hoping her plan would work. Now, the lady had been the star of a lot of movies, but for the life of her, she couldn't remember ever having been in The Queen in the Oven or even having heard of it before. But she couldn't resist Gretel's praise, so she said, "Oh, yes, that was a very demanding role," and wanted to hear more about it. "Do you know my favorite scene?" Gretel asked. "It still gives me goosebumps. It's the final scene where the enemy soldiers have broken into the castle and you flee into the kitchen." "The kitchen?" the lady repeated, visualizing it. "Hopelessly outnumbered, your kingdom in flames, you choose death before dishonor," Gretel said. "Yes," the lady declared, caught up in the story now. "The oven door is open. Without hesitation, you climb into it," Gretel said, keeping her eyes on the lady, and she began humming something tragic but tempestuous. "Of course," the lady cried, enjoying herself thoroughly. "My funeral pyre and my monument!" She even went so far as to climb into the oven, calling, "Farewell!" As soon as she was inside, Gretel slammed the door shut, jammed a chair under the handle so it wouldn't open, and turned the oven up as high as it would go. Then she ran to find Hansel. He was sitting in front of the triple mirror in one of Lady's long, sparkling dresses, choosing a wig for himself because his own hair was still so short. He had decided on one that was his own hair color and was just settling it on his head when Gretel came bursting in. "We're free," she panted. "Of course we're free," Hansel said, smoothing and fluffing the wig. "No, no, no," Gretel explained impatiently. "We can escape now. I pushed the witch into her own oven." "No," Hansel cried, and he ran into the kitchen with great speed because he knew the secret of running in high heels. But when he pulled the oven door open, there was absolutely nothing inside. "We've got to find her," he said. And while Gretel followed him uncertainly, he looked through every room of the cottage. But the lady was nowhere to be seen. Finally, he went back into the dressing room, and as he passed in front of the triple mirror, he saw her. She had big bouffant hair, and the light broke and danced on her dress, and oh, she was beautiful. When Hansel smiled with joy to see her, she smiled back, and when he raised his hand to his face, the lady raised her hand in farewell. "Why, I'm a star," he said, and he was amazed. "It is time for me to leave." He put on a wrap of white fur and walked to the door. "But what about me?" Gretel asked sadly. Hansel looked at her. It's true she wasn't glamorous, but he thought how clever she must have been to trick the lady into the oven. So he said, "You can be my manager." When the two of them opened the macadamia nut brittle front door, they found a path that ran all the way out of the great forest. Away at the end of it, tiny with distance but twinkling with many lights, they could see a city. Above the city, searchlights swung this way and that, as if announcing the premiere of a new star. And so, hand in hand, Hansel and Gretel set out together. I like that version. Yeah!
So, I talked before about like how this is near and dear to my heart. Kissing the Witch is about, it's a fairy tale retelling, this time with lesbians.
Yeah!
Yeah! So I love how you and me are just switching off here.
Do it!
It's fucking LGBT History Month, of course. So, this is the tale of the shoe. Till she came, it was all colds. Ever since my mother died, the feather bed felt hard as a stone floor. Every word that came out of my mouth limped away like a toad. Whatever I put on my back now turned to sackcloth and chafed my skin. I heard a knocking in my skull and kept running to the door, but there was never anyone there. The days passed like dust brushed from my fingers. I scrubbed and I swept because there was nothing else to do. I raked out the hearth with my fingernails, scoured the floor until my knees bled. I counted the grains of rice and divided brown beans for black. Nobody made me do the things I did. Nobody scolded me. Nobody punished me but me. The shrill voices were all inside. Do this. Do that, you lazy heap of dirt. They knew every question and answer, the voices in my head. Some days they asked why I was still alive. I listened out for my mother, but couldn't hear her among their clamor. When everything that could possibly be done was done for the day, the voices faded. I knelt on the hearth and looked into the scarlet cinders until my eyes swam. I was trying to picture a future, I suppose. Some nights I told myself stories to make myself weep, and stroked my own hair till I slept. Once, out of all the times when I ran out to the door and there was nobody there, there's still nobody there, but the stranger was behind me. I thought for a moment she must have come out of the fire. Her eyes had flames in the centers, and her eyebrows were silvered with ash. The stranger said my back must be tired and the sweeping could wait. She took me into the garden and showed me a hazel tree I'd never seen before. I began to ask questions, but she put her tiny finger over my mouth, so we could hear a dove murmuring on the highest branch. Turned out she had known my mother when my mother was alive. She said that was my mother's tree. How could I begin to describe the transformations? My old dusty self was spun new. This woman sheathed my limbs in blue velvet. I was dancing on points of clear glass. But then because I asked, she took me to the ball. Isn't that what girls are meant to ask for? Her carriage brought me as far as the palace steps. I knew just how I was meant to behave. I smiled ever so prettily when great doors swung wide to announce me. I refused a canapé and kept my belly pulled in. Under the 1,000 crystal chandeliers, I danced with elderly gentlemen who had nothing to say, but would not let that stop them. I answered only, indeed, and oh yes, and do you think so? At 10 to 12, I came down the stairs, and she swept me away. Had enough? She asked, lifting a hair off my long glove. But she was old enough to be my mother, and I was a girl with my fortune to make. The voices were beginning to jabber. They each told me to do something different. Take me back tomorrow night, I said. So she appeared again, just when the soup was boiling over, and took a silver spoon from her pocket to feed me. Her fingers drew pictures in the ashes on the hearth, various shapes of birds and islands. She showed me the sparkle in my eyes, how wide my skirt could spread, how to waltz without getting dizzy. I was lithe in green satin now. My own mother would not have recognized me. That night in the ball, I got right into the swing of things. I tittered at the king's old jokes. I accepted a single chicken wing and nibbled it daintily. I danced 3 times with the prince, whose hand wavered at the small of my back. He asked me my favorite color, and I couldn't think of any. He asked me my name, and for a moment I couldn't remember it. At 5 to midnight, when my feet were starting to ache, I waited on the bottom step and she came for me. On the way home, I leaned my head on her narrow shoulder, and she put one hand over my ear. Had enough? She asked. But I didn't have to listen to the barking voices to know the story went. My future is about to happen. Take me back tomorrow night, I said. So she came for me again, just when the small sounds of the mice were getting on my nerves. And she told me they were coachmen to drive us in state. She claimed her middle finger was her little finger was a magic wand. It could do spectacular things. It's like almost 4 in the morning, and I read that totally wrong. She could always make me laugh. That night my new skin was red silk, shivering in the breeze. The prince hovered at my elbow like an autumn leaf ready to fall. Musicians played the same tune over and over. I danced like a clockwork ballerina and smiled till my face twisted. I swallowed a little of everything I was offered, then leaned over the balcony and threw it all up again. I had barely time to wipe my mouth before the prince came to propose. Out on the steps he led me, under the half-full moon, all fairy tale. His long mustaches were beginning to tremble. He seemed like an actor on a creaking stage. As soon as the words began to leak out of his mouth, they formed a cloud in which I could see the future. I could hardly hear him. The voices were shrieking, "Yes, yes, yes, before you lose your chance, you big bag of nothingness." I opened my teeth, but no sound came out. There was no harm in this man. What he proposed was white and soft, comfortable as fog. There was nothing to be afraid of. But that just then, the midnight bell began to toll out the long procession of years. Partial day by moonless night. and I left backwards down the stair, leaving one shoe behind. The bushes tore my dress into old rags. It was perfectly silent on the lawn. She was waiting for me in the shadows. She didn't ask had I had enough. I had got the story all wrong. How could I not have noticed she was beautiful? I must have dropped all my words in the bushes, and I reached out. I could hear surprise on her breath. "What about the shoes?" she asked. "It was digging into my heel," I told her. "What about the prince?" she asked. "He'll find someone to fit if he looks long enough." "What about me?" she asked very low. "I'm old enough to be your mother." Her fingers were spelling on the back of my neck. "You're not my mother," I said. "I'm old enough to know that." I threw the other shoe into the brambles, where it hung, glistening. So she took me home, or I took her home, and we were both somehow taken to closest thing. So we really, I feel like we haven't talked enough about library advocacy during this time. And so let me tell you a little story. When I was a little Marissa in upstate New York and didn't really know my feelings, I went to the library, which is a place where you figure things out. And at the time, there wasn't as much LGBT-acquired materials as there is nowadays. I know, shocking, right? Yeah, I know, right? In upstate New York. So this was the only young adult book I could find that had anything to do with lesbians. There was Boy Meets Boy. David Levithan was really big back then, but it was still, once again, there's really no lesbians. There's mentions of bisexuality in Kissing the Witch, which of course I later found out I was. And this book really means a lot to me as far as acquiring the materials. And it's once again the idea that the library provided that. And of course, this book was kind of my gateway drug to lesbian authors such as Sarah Waters, such as Emma Donoghue, who also wrote not only this book, but other works of fiction about these characters. So I guess that once again ties into why the library matters, and why the library matters for, some kid who's also questioning themselves